Marcus bought his first house at 31 because that is what you're supposed to do. He had saved $55,000 for a down payment. He was tired of throwing money away on rent, and his parents kept asking when he was going to stop renting and build some equity. For Marcus, this was more than just a financial milestone, it was a psychological relief. He felt that by handing over a massive check and receiving a set of keys, he was finally playing the game of life correctly. He found a respectable three-bedroom home in a quiet, leafy suburb of Denver, priced at $550,000. He put down $55,000, which was a clean 10% of the purchase price, and financed the rest with a 30-year fixed mortgage at an interest rate of 6.9%. After the paperwork was signed and the champagne was popped, his primary mortgage payment sat at $3,215 a month. But as any seasoned homeowner will tell you, the mortgage is only the opening act. Once you've factored in the property taxes at $540, the homeowner's insurance at $215, and the mandatory HOA dues of $280 for the upkeep of the neighborhood parks, his total monthly cash outflow for housing jumped to $4,250. To put this in perspective, just 1 month earlier, Marcus had been living in a modern, light-filled apartment only 10 minutes away from his office. He paid $2,350 a month in rent, and that included his water, trash, and access to a high-end gym. Marcus didn't sit down with a spreadsheet to compare these two lives. He didn't account for the fact that his commute was now 20 minutes longer, or that he was now responsible for a lawn he didn't enjoy mowing. He simply operated on the common sense that has been drilled into the collective consciousness of the middle class for decades. Rent is a total loss, while a mortgage is a forced savings account. He believed that every dollar sent to the bank was a brick in the wall of his future wealth. 6 years later, the reality of that decision has finally begun to settle. Over those 72 months, Marcus has poured approximately $306,000 into his housing costs. Meanwhile, the Denver market, which seemed invincible when he bought, has cooled under the weight of high interest rates. His home is now appraised at roughly $585,000. It's a modest increase, but one that barely covers the cost of inflation over that period. After 6 years of making payments, his remaining mortgage balance has been whittled down to $472,000. On paper, Marcus looks at his equity and sees $113,000. He feels successful. He feels like he made the right choice because he has a wealth figure to point to. But here is the invisible, devastating reality that Marcus is completely unaware of. If Marcus had ignored the social pressure from his parents and the marketing from real estate sites, if he had stayed in that $2,350 apartment and invested the $1,900 monthly difference into a simple low-cost index fund, returning a historical average of 8%, that monthly contribution alone would have grown into approximately $182,000. Now let's look at his original $55,000 down payment. If that money had stayed in the same index fund instead of being locked in the wooden frame of a suburban house, it would have blossomed into roughly $87,000. When you combine those two figures, Marcus's liquid net worth as a renter would be $269,000. Compare that to his current reality. His home equity is $113,000. His alternative wealth in the market would have been $269,000. Mathematically, Marcus is $156,000 poorer today because he chose to build equity instead of renting. And the situation is actually worse than that. He cannot access that $113,000 of equity to pay for a medical emergency or a new business opportunity without either selling the entire house and losing 6% of the value to real estate agents or taking on a high-interest home equity loan. Marcus didn't build a financial fortress, he built a financial anchor. He didn't create wealth, he systematically liquidated his potential for the sake of a narrative. And the most tragic part is that he still tells his coworkers that buying was the smartest move he ever made, because no one has ever shown him the actual cold-blooded math. My name is Bobby, and I spend an obsessive amount of time deconstructing the rent versus buy decision that the vast majority of people get fundamentally and often catastrophically wrong. If you are currently a renter and you feel that nagging pressure to buy before you're left behind, or if you've already signed a 30-year mortgage and you're starting to wonder why your bank account feels so much lighter than the advertisements promised, or if you're simply trying to understand when a house actually transitions from a liability to an asset, you need to hit that subscribe button. What I'm about to show you is a framework that will tell you exactly when to stop renting, and it will likely reveal that the right time is much later and at a much different price point than everyone around you is suggesting. I call it the 5% rule, and it is the financial truth detector that the real estate industry hopes you never learn to use. To understand why the 5% rule is so important, we have to first dismantle the core lie of the housing market, the idea that rent is throwing money away while a mortgage is investing. This framing is a masterpiece of marketing, and it is so deeply embedded in our culture that questioning it feels almost like an act of financial heresy. But here's the objective truth. As a homeowner, you are also throwing money away. You're just throwing it into different, less visible buckets that don't have the word rent written on them. When you rent, your unrecoverable cost is your rent check. It's one big, obvious number. When you own, your unrecoverable costs are split into three distinct and often ignored categories: property taxes, maintenance, and the cost of capital. They're just as gone as a rent check, but because they're fragmented, our brains allow us to ignore them. The 5% rule is a simple way to estimate these unrecoverable costs so you can compare them directly to the cost of renting. It effectively allows you to compare apples to apples. The first bucket of unrecoverable costs is property taxes. This is money you pay to the government for the privilege of remaining in your own house. It doesn't pay down your debt, and it doesn't increase the value of your home. It is a pure expense, and on average, it accounts for about 1% of the home's value every single year. The second bucket is maintenance and repairs. Houses are physical objects that are constantly trying to fall apart. Roofs degrade, pipes corrode, and foundations shift. Even if your house is brand new, you are paying an entropy tax to keep it in its current condition. Experts generally agree that you should budget 1% of the home's value per year just to keep the house from depreciating. This isn't an investment in the value, it's the cost of maintaining the status quo. The third and largest bucket is the cost of capital. This is the one people understand the least, yet it is the biggest wealth destroyer of the three. The cost of capital is either the interest you are paying the bank for the money you borrowed, or the opportunity cost of the money you tied up in your down payment. If you have $100,000 in home equity, that $100,000 is not earning a 7 or 8% return in the global stock market. You are sacrificing that gain to own the bricks. When you blend together current mortgage rates and the lost gains on your equity, the cost of capital typically lands around 3% of the home's value annually. When you add these three together, 1% for taxes, 1% for maintenance, and 3% for capital, you get 5%. This 5% represents the annual friction of home ownership. It is the amount of money you are burning every year just to occupy that space. The 5% rule tells you this. If the annual cost of renting a comparable home is less than 5% of the purchase price of the house, you are financially better off renting. This is the break-even point, where the unrecoverable costs of renting finally equal the unrecoverable costs of owning. Let's look at how this math functions with real numbers, because the clarity comes from the calculation. Take a house priced at $750,000. Using the 5% rule, you multiply $750,000 by 0.05, which gives you $37,500 per year. Divide that by 12, and you get $3,125. That $3,125 is your magic threshold. It is your break-even rent. If you can rent a comparable house in that same neighborhood for anything less than $3,125, the math says you are winning by renting. You can take the money you aren't spending on taxes and repairs, invest it in the market, and build a higher net worth than the person who owns. However, if renting that same house costs $4,000, then the math shifts and buying starts to look like a sound financial decision. But when you apply this filter to the actual American landscape, the results are startling. Look at a market like San Francisco, where the median home price is roughly $1.5 million. Using the 5% rule, the break-even rent is $6,250 a month. Yet you can often rent a high-end apartment or a comparable house there for $4,500 to $5,000. In this scenario, the homeowner is throwing away significantly more money than the renter every single month, but they are hiding that fact from themselves by calling it building equity.
The same applies to cities like Austin, Texas. If a median home is $620,000, the break-even rent is about $2,583. If you can rent that same property for $2,300, you are making the smarter financial move by staying in the apartment and investing your surplus. However, in a market like St. Louis or Detroit, where home prices are low relative to rents, you might find a house for $240,000, where the break-even rent is $1,000, but the actual rent is $1,500. In that case, the 5% rule tells you to buy immediately, because the owner is the one saving money while the renter is overpaying. The 5% rule reveals a truth that contradicts almost everything you've been told. In the most popular, high-growth, and expensive metros in the country, renting is currently the faster path to wealth. The people who bought in these areas aren't necessarily geniuses. They are people who are paying a massive ownership premium for the emotional feeling of having their name on a deed, and they're using the building equity narrative to rationalize a lifestyle choice that the numbers simply do not support. Now, I know what the critics will say. But Bobby, what about appreciation? You're ignoring the fact that the house will be worth twice as much in 20 years. This is where we need to challenge the second great assumption of the real estate market. We have been conditioned to see a house as a high-growth investment asset, but history suggests otherwise. According to data from Robert Shiller, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who is the world's leading authority on housing bubbles, the average real return on residential real estate, meaning the return after you subtract the effects of inflation, is approximately 1% per year over the long term. Not 7%, not 10%, but 1%. While the stock market has historically delivered 7 to 8% in real returns, a typical house barely manages to outpace the cost of bread and milk. If you buy a $650,000 house today, in 30 years, its value in real purchasing power terms might only be around $877,000. You gained $227,000 in 3 decades. If you had taken that same $650,000, or the equivalent down payment and monthly savings, and put it into a broad market index fund, that money would have compounded into nearly $4.9 million in real terms. The house gave you $227,000. The market gave you $4.2 million in profit. The reason we think houses are such incredible investments is that humans have terrible memories for nominal versus real prices. We remember that our parents bought a house for $60,000 in 1975 and sold it for $450,000 today. We think, wow, they made $390,000. What we forget is that $60,000 in 1975 had the same buying power as roughly $330,000 today. We also forget the 40 years of property taxes, the 3 new roofs, the 2 kitchen renovations, and the hundreds of thousands of dollars in mortgage interest they paid. When you actually audit the life of that house, they didn't get rich, they just paid for their housing in a very expensive, illiquid way. Furthermore, the 5% rule already has reasonable appreciation baked into the cost of capital calculation. It assumes that your money is tied up in the house and therefore unable to earn a market return. For a house to truly be a superior investment, it has to dramatically and consistently outperform the long-term national average for decades. And betting your entire financial future on a single piece of property in a single neighborhood is a level of concentrated risk that most people wouldn't dream of taking with their stocks, yet they do it with their home without a second thought. Let's dive deeper into the hidden assassins of home ownership that make the 5% rule actually quite generous to owners.
The first is transaction costs. Renting is incredibly fluid. You pay a small application fee, and when you move, you might lose a cleaning deposit. Buying and selling a home, however, is a financial bloodbath. When you sell a house, you typically pay 5 to 6% in agent commissions, plus another 1 to 2% in closing costs, title insurance, and transfer taxes. On a $650,000 house, that is $45,000 to $55,000 that simply evaporates. If you only own a home for 5 or 6 years, those transaction costs alone can wipe out every single dollar of appreciation you gained. This is why buying is almost always a mathematical disaster if you aren't virtually certain you will stay for at least 7 to 10 years. If your life is in flux, if your job might move, if your family might grow, or if you just want the option to change your scenery, renting provides you with the ultimate financial asset: mobility. The second assassin is maintenance volatility. The 1% maintenance rule is a smooth average, but life isn't smooth. In your first 3 years of ownership, you might spend nothing. In year 4, your HVAC system dies, your water heater bursts, and your roof begins to leak in the same winter. Suddenly, you're looking at a $28,000 bill. For a renter, that is a simple phone call to the landlord. For a homeowner, that is a massive hit to your liquid net worth that can take years of disciplined saving to recover from. The third assassin is the opportunity cost of the down payment. This is the one that Marcus missed, and it's the one that most people ignore because it's invisible. When you lock $55,000 into a house, that money is no longer working for you in the global economy. It is earning the return of your local housing market instead of the return of the world's most profitable companies. Over 10 or 20 years, that 6% to 7% gap in returns compounds into a staggering amount of wealth that you will never see. Your down payment is a prisoner in your house, and its ransom is the massive wealth you are forfeiting every day it stays there. So, when does buying actually make sense? I am not here to tell you that renting is always the answer. I am here to tell you to make the decision with numbers, not with narratives. Buying a home makes sense when the local rental market is expensive relative to home prices, meaning your rent exceeds 5% of the purchase price. You are certain you will remain in that specific property for at least a decade, allowing you to amortize the transaction costs over a longer period. You have already maxed out all of your tax-advantaged investment vehicles, like your 401k and your IRA, and you're looking for a tax-efficient place to store excess capital. And you genuinely value the non-financial benefits of ownership: the stability, the creative control, the ability to plant a garden or remodel a kitchen, and you are willing to pay a lifestyle premium for those things even if the math doesn't perfectly align. The real problem is not the act of buying a house. The problem is the delusion that every house is a smart financial investment. If you want to buy a house because you want to paint the walls purple and never deal with a landlord again, that is a valid lifestyle choice. But call it what it is: a consumption decision. It is a purchase of a use asset, like a car or a nice watch. Don't tell yourself you're building wealth while your neighbor in the apartment is throwing money away. In many markets, your neighbor is the one quietly getting rich in the background while you're busy writing checks to the local hardware store and the county tax assessor.
Here's the framework I want you to use for your own life. Before you look at another open house, run through this specific process. First, find a realistic price for a home you would actually want to live in. Second, calculate 5% of that price and divide it by 12 to get your monthly break-even rent. Third, compare that figure to what you would actually pay to rent a similar property in the same area. If the rent is lower than the break-even number, the math says you should keep renting and invest every single dollar of the difference. Fourth, if you are still leaning toward buying, ask yourself honestly if you're ready to commit 10 years of your life to that specific zip code. If the answer is maybe or probably not, then the transaction cost will likely make the purchase a net negative for your wealth. Finally, calculate the compounded value of your down payment and your monthly savings over that same 10-year period if they were in the market. Compare that liquid, accessible fortune to the illiquid equity you would have in-house.
Most people who do this calculation with clear eyes discover that the path of renting and investing produces a significantly higher net worth. They just never did the math because the cultural narrative was too loud. Right now, you probably see yourself as someone who is either a renter who needs to graduate into homeownership or as a homeowner who made a brilliant financial move. I want you to see yourself as an investor who is choosing between two different housing structures with two different cost profiles. The 5% rule doesn't tell you how to live. It simply tells you the truth about the trade-off. It is a truth that the banks, the real estate agents, and even your well-meaning friends have no incentive to share with you. Renting is not throwing money away. Renting is paying for a service, the service of shelter, maintenance, and mobility. Owning is also paying for a service, the service of shelter, control, and stability. Both have costs that vanish into the ether. The question is not which one feels more adult or which one your parents did. The question is which one, in your specific market at your specific price point, allows you to build the most wealth over the long term. Marcus thought he was being responsible. He thought he was doing the right thing. But because he followed a story instead of a calculator, he ended up $156,000 poorer than he should have been. Don't be Marcus. Run the numbers. Understand your unrecoverable costs. And remember, you aren't throwing money away when you rent. In many cases, you are buying your future freedom. I've spent way too much time thinking about these invisible leaks in your bank account, so you don't have to. If this video changed how you look at your rent check or your mortgage statement, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dive into the math of everyday life. I'll see you in the next one.